I love how you talk about this film as being a public art project, and I wondered if maybe you could start us off by telling us a bit about this 1% commission and how you came to think about how a film could be a public artwork.
So the genesis of the project is when they built the school. They in France, when we build a public building, there's always a 1% of the budget to build the structure that is devoted to an art commission, and so usually it's a sculptor who builds a big mosaic on the facade of the building, or generally it's an object. And in this case, they solicited me because the school is built across the street from this humongous cinema production facility that was being created, and they thought it would be interesting to invite an artist who makes films to propose something for the commission. But I think it's the first time in the history of these commissions that an immaterial object was commissioned rather than a material object. And so I just proposed to them that I would... there's a cat in my microphone. All right, we use this one. So I said that rather than having an artwork in the building, we would have the building and the life inside the building inside of the artwork. So it's going to become a public artwork in the sense that it'll circulate, once we're done with the festivals, it'll circulate on YouTube, and it'll just be free to sort of be in the public sphere. But that the process was to work for 4 years with the same group of students from the first class of this new school all the way till their graduation. And that was the one thing I committed to, but we had no other, I had made no other plans than just to work with them for 4 years. There was no sort of stated goal or structure to the project beyond that.
And this 4-year period seems really significant in that it's a crucial time where they're transitioning from being children into teenagers, and we really see that evolution over the film. And so yeah, exactly. All right, we'll just keep trading. So I wondered if you could talk about how working with them evolved over these 4 years, and also just the conversations about cinema that you had with them. And we see in the film a lot of these different exercises and them really kind of internalizing these ideas and bringing them out when they're filming on their own. But yeah, just that process, and 4 years is a really long time. So I'm sure you have a lot to say, but
the first part of your question, why middle school? When I started to make the film in 2015, I think this would have been my 5th film, or maybe 4th film when I began it, and I had this idea that it was an important time to sort of renew the way in which I fabricated films and sort of change things in the way I worked, so as to avoid repetition, which I think is something that sometimes happens at that time in your career as a filmmaker, when you're more comfortable with certain ways of working, and I wanted to be less comfortable. So direct cinema I had never done before. I had never done anything that was sort of completely uncharted and unplanned, and I'd never worked with people for a duration. And I had an intuition that school was an important place to do a work about the here and the now, because that was the other thing, is I had made films about distant places or distant times. I had never done a film about where I lived, and that was about the now. And school seemed like an important place because that's where we fabricate sort of the next generation of citizens, and of course I think for obvious political and social questions, school was important. So, but why middle school rather than say high school or preschool? I talked with a lot of friends who are teachers, and they all sort of agreed that middle school was most interesting for this idea, because it's where, as they say, tout est possible. Everything's possible. Things are not determined yet, and in high school they usually are more determined, whereas these 4 years are the years where, from the perspective of my teacher friends, vast possibilities are opened or closed. And it proved true because it was very, very interesting to start working with them when they were 11, completely uninhibited. No sort of, the inhibition comes later with adolescence. And I think that if I had started working with them when they were already adolescents, it would have been very difficult to have this sort of free-flowing way of working, which we were able to keep somewhat through the difficult adolescent period. But because of the fact that we had been working together for so long. And to answer the second part of your question, the only sort of rule that I had set myself is that I was not there to teach anything. I never, ever considered that this was, that there was anything to be taught, that I had anything to instruct them. So I never took the position of telling them how to do anything. The most we ever told them how to do is how to turn on the camera. And then maybe sometimes I would repeatedly tell them not to shake the camera around too much because the audience might vomit during the screening. But aside from that, there was never any pedagogy, no pedagogy. And the idea is that school is a structurally hierarchical environment for various reasons. And filmmaking is a structurally hierarchical environment for similar reasons. And the idea was to see whether it's possible to work in a as unhierarchical as possible manner of working, yet being inside of a school and inside of the process of making a film. And so the way I found that it was the easiest to try to do this was by never knowing what we were going to do and never having too much of a plan. So usually it would be in the car going out to the school with my crew at the beginning, would be like literally 5 minutes away from the school when I would start saying, okay, what are we going to do today? And so we would come up with some idea, but the idea is just sort of a way of getting something started. And mostly what you see is not the idea that was hatched, in 5 seconds in the cab. And so a lot of the times it involved literally coming there and not having a plan, not doing anything, and then seeing what emanates. And then I think my role was more as when something interesting started to happen, to try to sort of give that space and maybe, orient it towards that interesting thing that's happening when somebody else wants to talk about Pokemon, and it's trying to deviate the less promising threads and trying to favor the more sort of interesting things that were happening. But mostly time was important because it allowed us to have the opportunity to wait and to hope for something to happen, or for certain kids to develop. The ones who are really interesting at the beginning are not necessarily the ones who have as much to say 3 years on, and vice versa. Fatimata, who's by far the star cinematographer in the group, and Claire Atherton, with whom I cut the film. I worked for 25 years with Chantal Ackerman, and then she said that she hasn't seen sort of such raw camera ability in anybody, and since Chantal, until she saw Fatimata's raw footage, and she's just gifted. But that it took 2 years for us to figure that out, and so that time was it was not a luxury. I think this film, which is by far the longest I've ever made and the most expensive I've ever made, even though you can't necessarily see that in the materiality of the film, we needed that time. It was not 4 years was really what it took.
Yeah, can you speak a bit more about the editing process? I know you talked about how initially you had cut it into a couple episodes, and those had their own life, but ultimately it felt like a feature-length film. So can you talk about working with Claire, but also were the students involved at all in the editing process?
So initially, I had this idea that I wanted to explore the format of a TV series, because I thought, if I'm going to be working all this time, we could. It seemed impossible not to restitute something back to the students before the end of the process. It was inconceivable that they would wait 4 years and never see anything. And so the first year, at the end of the first year, I worked with a different editor. I worked with François Gédigier, who's a fiction editor, like a very sort of well-known fiction editor who's cut most of Arnaud Desplechin's films. He cut La Sentinelle. I mean, he's a legendary editor, but he had never, ever, ever touched documentary material. And I heard him say this once at a master class, and so I went to see him and I said, well, would you like to try? You're 60 years old now. Do you want to give a shot at it? And I asked him why he'd never done it. He said, because it petrifies me. It's terrifying. And so we worked together for a year on the early material, and we cut these episodes that were about 40 or 50 minutes long, very, very different. And we did 2. And then, so the students were able to see the material, to see what they were doing. We showed them even in festivals. We showed them in exhibitions in Japan and France and Germany. But for me, there was something that wasn't working with this format. There was something that wasn't, it was interesting, it was even funny at times, but there's something that wasn't working. So we agreed to stop working together with François, and we'll do a fiction together next. But then I proposed the 3rd episode to Claire Atherton, with whom I had cut the previous film, also known as Jihadi. And there's something there with all the material that we did with the Foley work when I took the kids to the sea. And then something started happening there that made me feel like it was silly to try to continue to find these sort of modules, episodic modules, is a structure that I think could work, but not perhaps with this. Because really what I wanted to have is an experience of 2 hours of watching this entire thing in one space and one time, and to have a different sensation, a different experience with duration. Which I think is what we tried to do, which is something that comes very naturally to Claire, because duration is, I think, the material that she's most interested in exploring, and the possibility of it's a very simple edit in a way. If you look at the timeline on a computer, it's just a series of shots very carefully, put together, but it's not at all your
it's more or less chronological. Right?
It's deceitfully, it actually isn't as much as it, we worked so that it would look chronological, but for example, they never touched a camera for the first 2 years. And the first shot of the film is one of their images. So chronologically, they did not touch the cameras until the 8th grade. But we decided to start cutting the material that they were shooting from the beginning of the film, which sort of gives you an idea that they might have been doing it at the same time as you see them in their smaller age. So it is a simple structure, but there are sort of some things like that I think were super important, because I think if we had started introducing their material halfway through the film, which is what it would have been if it had been true to the way we worked, I think it would have, and this was Claire's intuition, that it would have really started to feel more sort of, well, first we talk, and then we take the camera, and then we start seeing their images. And I think that what's really strong about the Claire's propositions in the early stages of the editing is that the difficulty in fabricating a film like this is that the process of making it was quite democratic and quite sort of horizontal. But a film and its narrative and its structure in a school very quickly becomes about, look at how they're growing, look at how, the presence of the adults makes, them change. And this is what we desperately wanted to avoid. And what we understood immediately is that the best way to do that is for there to be no adults in the film. There's never a teacher. We filmed hours in the classroom. There's tons of material with grown-ups. But eventually to evacuate completely any other presence than the group, and to try as much as possible to not be into this thing about how they are growing or developing or learning, because I think that would have put the film in this sort of longer tradition of the film about sort of people who grow and who learn and who teach, and this is not what we wanted to do. I don't know if there's a part of the question I didn't address. Okay.
Oh no, were they part of that?
Yes, that was the important part. No, it's an important part because, in effect, no, they did not. The only part of the fabrication where they were not involved is the editing, and this is something I knew from the beginning, because I think that even collaborative filmmaking, I think, is incredibly interesting in most aspects of filmmaking, but I think that what happens behind the editing station is an extremely intimate process between a director and an editor, and I don't think it would have benefited from a group dynamic. And so yes, to some extent, that's one of the reasons why the credits are so long, and I apologize about that, but is because it felt incredibly important for the credits to take time to explain what everybody did. So who took the images? Whose images are they? Whose images of the group? Whose images, so trying to explain how the film worked in the credits, inescapably you do get to, editing is Claire Atherton. And at the end, I say it's a film by Éric Baudelaire, which does not mean that it's not a collective film. But at some point, somebody has to take responsibility for some of these decisions. And it doesn't mean it's not a collective work, but there are certain things that were less collective.
Let's open up to some questions. We have one here, and there's a mic coming towards you.
Hello, hold on. Eric, first of all, congratulations. It's amazing. Given the amount of footage that you've taken, I'm assuming there must have been an infinite possibility of editing or assembling, or did you start through different paths and then, you explained how you started with a series first and then went to the one film. Were there other films? I'm assuming you could do an infinite number of films given the amount of footage. Were there other paths that you explored?
I've never, two things. One is that there was a lot of footage, but it's not a monumental amount of footage either. It's not like one of these 1,000-hour footage films. This is probably 150, 200 hours. I don't even know. I don't think we ever counted. Because we filmed a lot as adults coming into the school in the first 2 years, but when they filmed, they were actually really efficient. Fatimata would bring back 27 minutes of just like pure gold. Occasionally, I would, Ambrine might have brought back an hour and a half of Pokemon, but which we didn't necessarily watch entirely. But like the really good material, they were very parsimonious and very precise, and so it wasn't hundreds of hours of their footage. And to the other part of your question, I tend to not be a director that edits enormous things and then goes back and forth and back and forth, especially since I've been working with Claire. But even when I edited the films myself, I tend to be very deliberate and slow, but to never sort of undo significant portions of what was done, except in this case with the episodes, which I completely threw in the trash bin. And when we went back to the editing table, which was a year ago, basically, we went back to minute 1 of day 1 of shooting. So we'd already edited all these, almost 3 hours of film, and we'd shown it. We'd even had Q&As with the audience at a festival in France a year and a half ago. And then when I thought, okay, this isn't working, with Claire, we went back and we re-looked at all of the footage, and I didn't even open my notebook from the first edits. So that's the only time I've ever done that in a film, and that was humongously luxurious to be able to do that, and very hard. I think more for me than for Claire, who was looking at a lot of this material for the first time. But then once we started, it's comme tricoter de faire un film. It's like knitting, And once we'd started to knit this one, we didn't unknit much. Usually we take apart like a tiny thread here and there, and it's a careful process, and it's I think a 15 or 16 week edit process, so it's a long editing, but it's very deliberate, and then it doesn't we didn't throw anything out. We were just sort of progressively building upon it.
I think there was one down here.
So there was a moment when the students were kind of talking about origin and ethnicity, and one of the students mentioned, I was born in 2004, I'm not historical, and I found that to be like a really interesting moment, just because like such a huge part of growing up is realizing like history is like an active process, especially in these times. Your body of work is like politically oriented. In this project, could you speak about trying to like balance politics and like history is like they work in documentary, where you like you talked about not trying to like portray them as like growing up, but I guess just kind of like speak to your aims in terms of what like history and like politics play in the role of this project.
Well, you know, very simply is that the politics intruded into the life of the project without me needing to do anything, because we started shooting in September of 2015, and in November 2015 were the attacks in Paris that occurred, you know, that unfolded 200 meters away from the school when they bombed it, when they attacked the football stadium, and then when the perpetrators were surrounded by the police and killed, it happened, you know, 400 meters away from the school. So, and then the very next day, their lives changed. Their parents' lives changed, as it did for a lot of Americans after 9/11, and they talk about it. So it seemed, you know, throughout that period, we did a lot of one of the things I did do with them was I said, let's do storyboards, let's draw. So I would come with big sheets of paper and we would just draw possible films, and the politics of their lives were just immediately on paper. So I wouldn't say that I really didn't have an aim in this instance. What we talked about might have generated other conversations when they had, you know, an adult interested in hearing their perspective, or several adults interested in hearing their perspective of what they had to say without framing it or without context. It might have generated more discussions. But then there were the elections. The elections are super political. You know, race relations are entirely artificially injected inside of the political discourse at the presidential election process, with Marine Le Pen and all the other candidates responding to this, et cetera, et cetera. And they're like sponges. They just like, you know, and so a lot of this material is not, it's just what it is. So, you know, it turns out that I'm more interested in cutting this into the film than when Ambrine tells me about her Pokemon cards. But I also think their lives are super politicized. You know, what's one of the things that touches me when I watch the film again is that it seems like their lives are political from the get-go. The way they discuss it, the way they talk about it, the way they verbalize it over the course of 4 years evolves a lot. And I think that's the process of becoming a little citizen, so to speak. When Guyanis at the end, the sort of like facing the camera, I'm not even in the room during that whole phase. When there's David and Guyanis are doing and Guyanis is talking about what it's like living in the 9/3 and what it means, you know, when a cop gets beat up, et cetera, et cetera. There's no adults in the room at all in that session. It's just them and the camera, and they're autonomous by then. I discovered that footage later, you know, like 6 months later when I was watching it. So that's what I mean by it's a collective project, and that the subject matters are not necessarily mine.
We're going to have to wrap it up, but thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you.